We're looking at a biblical response to a biblical problem. And the biblical problem is what's going on in the Middle East today, which was prophesied about 3 centuries ago. That it was going to. So we've had a little bit of warning, haven't we? Just think if you had 3 centuries of warning, or three millennium, like 3 millennia of warning of what's happening in the Middle East. And I don't know where your heart is at concerning Israel. This study was really eye-opening to me because I learned a lot of new things I didn't know, and I'm just presenting the facts. That's what I'm doing today, okay? So this starts really because a number of people have been asking my opinion. As the lead pastor of Destiny Church, they're saying, well, what is your opinion? How do you perceive what's going on in the Middle East right now and in the world scene? And so for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to share what I feel are the most important things to understand about what is going on, okay? This week I'm going to talk about, go back there, how did we get to where we are? And then next week, or I should say because we really need to understand the history. History is so important. And because of history, we'll understand why most of the suggested solutions from around the world, just do this, do that, well, they're not going to work. And I explain to you why they're not going to work. And next week I'm going to share on where do we go from here. And please don't miss next week because that's really what we're going to walk in the coming years, okay? And I'm going to give us some strategies for our lives to really focus on. But so where do we start? Where do we start in this whole thing? Well, we start with God's plan for Israel. That's what this is really all about. What is God's plan? We know what the different countries' plans are, but what is God's plan concerning Israel? And let's go right back to Abraham's journey to the Promised Land, which was around 1920, 1921 BC. So we're talking 3 millennia ago, okay? And in Genesis chapter 12, while Abraham was living in a place called Haran at the north end of Mesopotamia, about 1921 BC, God called Abram to go to the Promised Land. And there it is right there. Genesis 12, 1-3. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will. So understand this. Leave your father's household. So the promise was not for Abraham and his relatives. It was only for the descendants of Abraham. And that's important to understand because he did have a nephew called Lot. Okay? And that's a whole nother thing. So go to land I'm going to show you. I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. And so God's plan for a land for the people of Abram was first announced around 1900 BC. Okay, 3 millennia ago, 1920. I'm sorry, if only I had gone to university and learned some basic math, eh? If only. Okay. 4, I'm sorry, let's clarify that. 4 millennia ago, close to 2000 BC. And in Genesis chapter 15, God then described the boundaries of this promised land. Genesis 15, 18-21. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land from the river of Egypt. What's the river of Egypt? The Nile, right, on the west. To the great river, the Euphrates, on the east, which was in the Mesopotamian valley, where Ur the Chaldees is, all the way up to Haran. That was the Mesopotamian valley. And then the land of the Hittites, Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Raphaites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, Jebusites, termites, all those ites, okay? All those ites. Yeah. Those termites that are really bothering us today, right? And so all these tribes, not talking about Egypt or Euphrates, but all those tribes there were all descendants of Canaan, and Canaan was cursed by Noah, that's right, because his son Ham, Noah's son Ham, had seen his nakedness. We don't have time to get into what that means, but anyway, ended up cursing Ham's son Canaan. And so all of these people there are under this curse by Noah. Now, when we actually map out these coordinates, here's what it looks like. Okay, we have, there's the great river, the Nile. Okay, there's the Nile. Okay, and you can see this is Egypt right here. This is the Sinai Peninsula. Goes across through the north end of Saudi Arabia, up the Euphrates River. Okay, there's down about there somewhere, and there's Haran up there. And all this land out to the Mediterranean, okay? So you can see there's Jordan right here, okay? There's Israel there. There's half of Iraq. There's Syria, right, half of Syria, and a bit of Turkey, okay? And there's Lebanon. We're all part of the promised land. That's what God promised, okay, to them. Okay, pretty big hunk of land. What they're actually living in like that much today. But that was what God initially planned for them, what God initially promised. So let's move on quickly. So then there was this hostility between Abraham's son Isaac and Ishmael, Abraham's sons Isaac and Ishmael, just 20 years after he was called out of Haran. There started to be some problems. Okay, Genesis 16, Sarah's servant Hagar, through Abram, gave birth to Ishmael. And with that birth came a pretty sad promise. Genesis 16, verse 12. This talking about Ishmael will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility to all of his brothers. Okay, so there it is. We were warned 4,000 years ago that the descendants of Ishmael would be hostile to the sons of Abram, which are Isaac, Jacob, who became Israel. Okay. Now who the sons of the Ishmael? His descendants became the Arabs. That's Ishmael's descendants. Okay. So it started about 1900 BC, and then we come to this Genesis 17:20. And as for Ishmael, I've heard you, Hagar, in your prayer. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. And he will be the father of 12 rulers. And we trace the history. There was indeed 12 princes came out of Ishmael. And I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, who Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. So God promised to bless the descendants that were born to Ishmael, okay? And certainly they are. There's many of the Arabs are very wealthy people. They have much land, wealth. And they all settled in the area known as Saudi Arabia, okay, in the Arab Peninsula and that area. And they gave rise to the Arab nations. However, the covenant, which included ownership of that initial promised land, was for Isaac and his descendants, okay? Now, unfortunately, in Genesis chapter 25, I don't have the scriptures, but Esau and Jacob were born to Isaac, okay? But Esau foolishly sold his birthright to Jacob, and it was a legal binding thing. And in Genesis 26:34, Esau made another really poor choice by marrying Judith the Hittite. And the Hittite is one of those Canaanite groups, those groups that were cursed by Noah, that God had forbidden Abraham and his descendants from intermarrying with. So Esau double blew it there, okay? And Esau, his descendants are called the Edomites. I guess Esauites sounded kind of weird. So the Edomites and the Edomites are living in the area today known as Jordan. Okay, and also southern Judah. They started off in Jordan, then they moved into southern Judah. Okay, so that's where the Edomites are. Okay, now let's keep moving on. Israel now becomes named Jacob, and the Israelis. We're going to look at some history around 1750 BC. What happened? Genesis 32:28. Then the angel said to Jacob, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome. So at that point, Jacob's name was changed to Israel, from which we get the word Israeli. Okay? Look, still, 1750, so almost 4 millennia ago, the Israelites were officially created as a people, although they existed beforehand, all the way back through Abraham. So, and as we know, that from Israel came the 12 tribes of Israel that still exist today. So the Israelis are, as a people group, are almost 4,000 years old, but then they go back even to Abraham and then into his parents, well, who were Mesopotamians. But the Israeli history really started through Abraham and especially Israel. So we're still talking 1750 BC. Okay, so let's move on here. Possession of the Promised Land. Some people, they argue a lot between 12 and 1400 BC, but I'm going to take us on a quick journey from 12 or 1400 BC all the way to 1918 AD, which you may know is towards the end of the First World War. Okay. Settlement of the Promised Land. The modern area of Gaza, okay, Gaza's in the news, in case you haven't heard, and Israel, and the West Bank, and even Western Syria, and northeastern Egypt was known as Canaan, because that's where all the descendants of Canaan lived, okay? So basically what we know today is the Palestine and Transjordan. Transjordan is the east side of the Jordan River, okay? And Canaan was home to the 7 Canaan nations. There were 7 major Canaan nations. We read them earlier. As well as there was on the other side, on the Transjordan side, there was the Ammonites, the Moabites, okay, Ammonites and Moabites on the right-hand side, and then down at the bottom was the Edomites of the, we're talking the Dead Sea, okay? There was the Ammonites, Moabites, and then Edomites, okay? And the first large-scale settlement of the region began around 1200, because that was when the Israelites crossed over the Jordan River, right, north of the Dead Sea, and into the Promised Land, okay? So they officially, now Abram had lived in the Promised Land, but he kind of moved around. He's Bethel and another couple places, went over to Egypt for a while, got in trouble, came back and back to Bethel. And so he'd been living there in different places, but now there was a big settlement of a few million Israelis in about 1200 BC, okay? And as they got there, this became the time of the judges, okay? And then the area became established as the United Kingdom of Israel under the leadership of who? David? Solomon. Yeah, actually Saul, David, and Solomon created the nation of Israel from 1020 BC, so about 3 millennia ago, till about 930 BC, okay? And then the northern kingdom, there was a civil war, and the northern kingdom was split the kingdom was split into 2 kingdoms, right? The north was Israel, and the south was Judah. Israel in 720 BC, they were conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and the Assyrians were basically where Syria is in the Mesopotamian Valley and places like that. That was Syria, owned all that land, and they came over and they attacked Israel. And then in 586, a couple hundred years later, sources are talking 2.5 millennia ago, Judah was conquered by the Babylonian Empire, okay? But do understand, although they were conquered, not everyone was taken away, okay? Certain proportion of land, mostly the rulers, were either killed or taken back to Assyria or Babylon, but there was still an Israeli population in those lands, okay? They never did get all the Israelis out of the land, okay? So really, right from that time, right up to 1918, this territory was fought over, okay, and controlled by a lot of different empires, such as the Assyrians first, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, and then the Romans, and then by the Byzantines. And who are the Byzantines? They are the remnant of the Eastern Roman 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 Empire was destroyed, but Eastern Roman Empire continued as the Byzantines. And then the Arab Islamic Caliphate took it over about 633 AD, okay, about 100 years after Islam was formed, okay? And then came the Crusader kingdoms. There were three major Crusader kingdoms in that region, but then it went back to the Arabs about 1300, 12 or 1300. And then it was conquered under, and this is the important thing, under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. Now, who's the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Empire is actually the Turkish Empire. The Turks up north in the Mediterranean spread down, and they took over all of that area, Promised Land, Transjordan, Syria, and they even went down into Egypt and even around the south of the Mediterranean Sea. They had a huge kingdom, empire, okay? And they remained there from what, probably maybe 1300 AD until the end of the First World War, when they were conquered, okay? Like for a long time they ruled, right? So, but during that entire time, there was still a population of ethnic Jews living in the Promised Land, okay? They were still living there, okay? Now, let's talk about now the Palestine and the Palestinians. Okay, so the area between the Mediterranean, remember, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Jordan River became known as Palestine, although it really did move into the Transjordan on the east side, because if you remember, there were 2.5 tribes of the Israelis on the east side also. But this name became known as Palestine, and it was named, but it was not renamed Palestine. We hear a lot about Palestine. It was not renamed Palestine until a Roman emperor in 150 AD. He had stopped a Jewish rebellion, and when he decided to change the name from Canaan to Palestine, Syria, because the east of the Jordan he called it Palestine, and west of the Jordan he called Syria, which it still is to the day. But he did it as an insult to the Jewish people because the word Palestine is a variation of the word Philistine. Okay? And the Philistines were the former oppressors of the Jewish people. The Philistines, very important we understand this, were not part of the Canaanites. Remember all the ites? The Philistines were not part of the Canaanites. Actually, the Philistines were a people who came from Crete and Greece over to the coast of the Mediterranean and settled in the land that is presently known as Gaza Strip. Okay? They were not Canaanites. And interestingly enough, as the Israelites were coming in the north end to settle in the Promised Land, at almost the exact same period of time, the Philistines came over from Greece and settled on the coast and set up the country of Philistine, which no longer exists, okay? But as a result, the Philistines were not Canaanites. As a matter of fact, just a few years ago, they did DNA tests on all of the Palestinians that are living in Gaza. None of them have any Philistine DNA. None of them. Because Philistines were completely wiped out, mostly by King David. The Philistines were conquered. Remember all the fights, Goliath, they were all conquered by King David, but then they were completely destroyed sometime after that, according to God's promise. Here's God's promise. Oh, look, Gaza's in the Bible. Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 4 to 7, one of the prophets of Israel, of the Jewish prophets. Gaza will be abandoned, completely left, okay? And Ashkelon, which was just north of Gaza, left in ruins. At midday, Ashdod, another small city north of Gaza, will be emptied and Ekron uprooted. Woe to you who live by the sea, right, the Philistine area, O Kerith people, Kerithite people. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines. Okay, so it was the land of Canaan. Okay, it was the Canaanite area, but it was conquered by the Philistines. So the Philistines came in and drove out the Canaanites in about 1200 BC, and there was no Palestinians living there. It was only Philistines. So it was called the land of the Philistines. And I will destroy you God says, I will destroy you, and none will be left. The land by the sea where the Kerethites dwell will be a place, and the Kerethites were one of the tribes of the Philistines. There will be a place for shepherds and sheep pens. And for so many years, that's the only people, just shepherds. After the Philistines were destroyed, only a few scattered shepherds live there. But then God says, okay, once the Philistines are out of there, oh, look at this. That land, Gaza Strip, will belong to the remnant of the house of Judah. So here we have, what's the time? Let me just get the exact time here. We're talking, I didn't put down the time here. Anyway, so we're talking around, probably around 586, maybe 200 BC. God said, that land the Philistines had, that's going to be yours, Judah. I promise that'll be your land. Not only interesting, but important to know. Okay, so moving on. Okay, the promise of a Jewish homeland. Okay, remember, even though there were Jews still living there, the place was now called Palestine by the Roman emperor in 150 AD, and so it was no longer called Israel, even though there were many Israelis living there. Okay, so let's 1918, end of the First World War. Now, I should say the Ottomans, remember the Ottomans, those people from Turkey, the Turkish Empire, they conquered Palestine in 1500 AD, really 1516, but okay, say 1500. So really, I guess from 1500 until 1918, so 400 years. I forget my math right here. The Ottoman Empire were in the land. I'm sorry, I think I said earlier it was 14, but it's really 1500 AD. And they controlled the land, which is today known as Israel, as well as the West Bank, as well as Gaza Strip, and also some land on the east side of the Jordan River known as the Transjordan. And it was all owned by the Ottoman Empire. In 1915, just before the end of the First World War, Britain promised the Arabs, remember all those guys south of the Dead Sea who are descendants of Ishmael, said, hey, if you guys will fight for us in this war and fight against the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, we will give you independence and you'll have your own land back. Because the Ottomans were occupying that territory where the Arabs were. So the Ottoman says, the Arabs says, sure, we'll fight for you, Britain. And sure enough, they defeated the Ottoman Empire, and the Arabs were given the whole Arab peninsula, or what do you want to call that, Saudi Arabia, okay? And then 1916, a year later, there was also called the Balfour Declaration, where Britain said, you know what, we're going to give Israel some land too, okay, in Palestine. The Jewish people in Palestine, that was like 1916, but it didn't happen. In 1920, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, Britain took control of the whole land. Okay, all the land in the Middle East, or like in the Israel and Gaza and West Bank, that was run by the Ottoman Empire. Britain took it over, and it was at that time it was officially known as Palestine and the Transjordan. So they decided Palestine didn't include the Transjordan. Now they were separate. Okay. That was 1920. And Britain ruled from 1920 to 1948, okay, 28 years. However, after the world saw, so that promise in 1916 that you're going to have your own land, they never thought much of it. But after they discovered the horrors of the Holocaust, they said, you know what, we better keep our promise. We need to give you a piece of land that you can call your own, and why don't we give you the old land you used to be on, because you live there anyway, and there's all these historic and religious significances to the land of Israel, or the Promised Land. Okay, so that brings us up to 1947. Okay, then now we're getting into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, starting in 1947. Until then, there was all these skirmishes, but they were still living together. The Israelis and the Arabs were living together in the land. Okay, and if you want, check out the movie The Exodus with Paul Newman, I think, is in it, and somebody else. It's a great pretty accurate description of what happened in 1947, 1948, okay? So it's probably free online because it's an old movie now. Anyway, in 1947, there was a UN resolution, okay? On November 27th, 2 years after the end of World War II, after waves of Jewish immigration now into Palestine, there was all these extra Israelis there, and they said, you know what, let's give them some land now. And at the same time, the United Nations, who had fought together during the Second World War, they said, we need to get out of this land. It's really not ours. We need to get out. And so the United Nations voted to get out of the land and partition Palestine into two separate states. Okay, now we're talking this concept of partition. Started in 1947. They said we're going to have one Jewish state and one Arab state. Okay, and the Jewish leaders said, hey, let's go for it. And the Arabs said, no, we don't want you to have your own land. And so immediately there was all these clashes between the Jews and the Arabs in Palestine, right from the UN resolution. And you can see that clearly in that movie I just referred to. Well, then, in 1948, when the British decided, you know what, we're getting out of this land too, on May 15th, 1948, Israel declared, as soon as Britain got out, the very next day, Israel declared independence. And as soon as they declared independence, suddenly Arab forces from Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon invaded Israel, okay, in 1948, and the war lasted. It's called the Arab-Israeli War, lasted over a year, okay. And at the same time, the Arabs were so upset, they kicked somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 Jews out of the other Arab lands where they've been living in peace together too. Well, it's generally peace. Okay, so suddenly there's 800,000 Israeli refugees from the other Arabic lands. Where are we going to live? Oh, we know. Israel, where they just declared independence. So there's this huge, almost like 750,000 influx of Jewish people into the Promised Land at that time. Now, at the same time, the Jews were actually being accused by the Arabs of saying, look, you're kicking all the Arabs out of Israel. And so they started saying, look, you know, like, we want another reason to persecute you. But what really happened, the Arabs said to the Palestinians, the Arab people in Palestine, they say, get out of here, get out of the area as soon as you can. We're going to wipe Israel off the map. We're going to completely wipe it off the map. So if you want to save your lives, get out. So all the Arabs left, and then they made this rumor that said they'd been kicked out by the Jews, but they hadn't. Because the Arabs and Jews had been living at peace until they declared independence. As a matter of fact, today, there are still over 2 million Arabs still living in Israel, still today. Okay, this whole concept that the Jews don't want the Arabs living with them is totally wrong. Okay. Now, when the Arab-Israeli War ended in 1949, Israel signed independent agreements with all those countries they just talked about, okay? And here's another interesting thing. When they made these agreements, Israel only took 77% of the land of Palestine. Jordan took 22% of the land. Okay, it didn't all just go to Israel. Israel gave 22% land after that war to Jordan to populate. And today we know that is the West Bank, okay? And then Egypt took 1% of Palestine, and that was the area today called the Gaza Strip. For a short period of time, it was owned by Egypt, okay? Then we go, again, moving very quickly through history. Then we had the Six-Day War in 1970. The Six-Day War, oops, I went back. Okay, Six-Day War in 1967, where Syria attacked from the Golan Heights, which is just past the West Bank, just north of the West Bank. And at the same time, Egypt attacked Israel from the south, okay? And Israel responded, and they totally wiped out the Egyptian Air Force at that time. Took every last plane out of the air. And they drove the Syrian forces back from the Golan Heights. Okay, and Israel captured and occupied some of the West Bank, also the Gaza Strip, and some other Arab territories. But they did that because they were hoping to exchange that land for peace in the future. So they said, let's take the land, but let's use it as leverage to try to get peace in the Middle East. Then we come to the Yom Kippur War, which surprisingly happened on the day of Yom Kippur on October 6, 1973. The Egyptians attacked again from the south, and the Assyrians attacked again from the Golan Heights. They came back into the attack the Israels, and during that time, Israel retook some of the West Bank again, but some of the land in the Sinai Peninsula was lost to the Egyptians. Okay. Just trying to give you general history. You don't have to, no tests on any of this, okay? Peace with Israel. I put this down because this is so important. In 1978, Israel returned the entire Sinai Peninsula, which was theirs, okay? They returned all of that land to Egypt with the agreement that Egypt would recognize Israel's right to exist. So from 1978, Egypt has said Israel has a right to exist, okay? The first Arab nation to recognize that Israel had the right to exist, okay? And they came up with the two-state solution again, but nothing happened with it, because nothing can happen with it. But anyway, that's another story. Okay, conflict with the PLO Hamas. We're getting close to our present time. Started in 1982, okay? We take a step back, though, in 1964. In 1964, which is 60 years ago, the Palestine Liberation Organization was formed in 1964, and its charter, okay, is 3 points. It's a very simple charter, only 3 points. Number one, Palestine has the right to be an independent state. Great, no problem. Number two, the total liberation of Palestine. Oh, well, that just happens to be where Israel lives. And number three, the complete destruction of the state of Israel. Those are the 3 points to the PLO charter, Palestine Liberation Organization. The total destruction of the state of Israel, taking back all the land that Israel was given by the United Nations, and they would live as an independent state, okay? Well then, there it is, formation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Then came the Lebanon War in 1982, on June 14th, 1982. Israel went to war with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who were occupying southern Lebanon. PLO was not occupying Palestine, they were occupying southern Lebanon, including Beirut. And they were attacking Israel from there. And at the end of the war, it was with Lebanon in 1982, the PLO were kicked out of Beirut and much of Lebanon. And in return, the Israelites completely withdrew from Lebanon a couple years later. So Lebanon had all the land that Israel used to live in Lebanon. Okay, so now Lebanon gets all the land back. They just had to promise not to let the PLO back in. And the PLO was not there. But now Hamas is there. No, I'm sorry. Now Hezbollah, that's true. Hezbollah's there. Okay. Then in 1993, another two-state solution. Okay. They again agreed with the Israelites and the PLO agreed to a two-state solution. And in return, Israel agreed to withdraw to its pre-1967 borders. Okay. We're going to give back the West Bank. We're going to give back the Gaza Strip. We're going to give back all this extra land. And all you have to do, PLO, is to renounce terrorism and violence. Didn't quite work, yeah. And again they said, hey, another two-state solution was never ratified. 1994, Israel withdrew from Gaza and Jericho. Okay, they did anyway. We're getting out of Jericho, we're getting out of Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority set up the government in those cities and in other cities too. Okay, so the PLO is now operating out of Gaza. Okay, and in 2005, so what are we talking? 19 years ago? Yeah, 19 years ago, the Jewish prime minister gave Gaza solely to the Arabs. Said, from now on, the Gaza Strip is yours. You want your country? Here it is. You can have the Gaza Strip. All you have to do is agree to peace. And all the Israelites, every last Israelite, was removed from the Gaza Strip. The Israelites dismantled every Jewish settlement in the Gaza Strip, along with 54 settlements in the West Bank. They said, no longer will any Jews live. So this whole thing that, people have said, well, the Israelites are occupying Gaza Strip. not since 2005. They gave it to the Palestinians completely. For 19 years, there's been no Jewish people living at all in that area. Okay, but shortly after they gave the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians, to the Arabs, Hamas caused an overthrow. Now, Hamas came in, we somehow got order, and they took over the Gaza Strip, and they basically eliminated all the other governments that had been voted in. And so Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in, I think, about 2007, something like that. Okay? And you know, some of the, and Hamas, as we know, is a violent terrorist organization. And at that point, Hamas says, hey, let's talk about that two-state solution thing again. And Israel said, no, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Like PLO was bad enough, but we're not negotiating with you guys. And so that didn't go anywhere either. Well, then shortly after was another war with Lebanon. This time, a group that rose up called Hezbollah in Lebanon attacked Israel. And the war only lasted 34 days. But because the fighting was so intensive and the Hezbollah militants, whatever, were so vicious, they got pretty much the respect of most of the Arab countries. So that's why they've never been stopped from existing, because they were, wow, we like these type of guys. Okay, let's very quickly, we're getting there. Ongoing conflict, yeah. So over the last 50 years, okay, say generally about 50 years, Israel's managed to improve some relations with some of its historical enemies. Like, for example, Egypt has officially recognized Israel as a nation, and they also have a pretty good relationship with Jordan, and I think with Kuwait also. There's a fairly good relationship. But lasting peace and recognition of Israel's right to exist has been very difficult to achieve. Why? Well, largely because of the emergence of terrorist organizations like Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen. And if you haven't noticed, the last couple of weeks, just before the ceasefire, that Yemen was starting to throw rockets into Israel again, and the Islamic State, which is in Iraq and Syria. Okay? So even before the attack by the Hamas on October the 7th, just not too long ago, Israel had already been putting up with one rocket attack every hour around the clock for the last number of decades. You just consider what that would be like, say, in Montreal, and every hour another rocket blows up something in your land, right? And that's what they've been putting up with for decades, okay? So all the terrorist organizations, they justify their terrorist activity, even with the civilians, because they're saying they're all just colonists. They're recent to the land. They're trying to take over our land, so we have a right to kill them all, not just the military, but even the civilians. And so that's why they justify killing civilians, because they're all colonizers. But whereas really we've seen that Jews have been living in Palestine for over 3,000 years. And as I said, Gaza had never belonged to the Palestinians until 2005. Okay? AD, yeah. And you know, even if, so they're still talking two-state solution. You know, all the main leaders are saying, well, we got to get back to that two-state solution. Would you like to live right next door to a country that believes that Allah has commanded you to kill the Israelites as an act of worship, and who will continue to bombing you around the clock every day in, day out? Like, the concept of a two-state solution only works if both states are agreed to live together in peace, and that's not going to happen as long as these different organizations exist, because they're committed to wipe Jews off the earth. And you know, this goes back so far. Look at this verse, Psalm 83, verse 2-8. See how your enemies, this is the psalmist talking to God. See how your enemies are astir, how your foes rear their heads. With cunning they conspire against your people. They plot against those that you cherish. Come, they say, let us destroy them as a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. With one mind, they plot together. And that's what's been happening. Remember, this was written in about 500 BC, right? With one mind, they plot together. They form an alliance against you. The tents of Edom, which is the Jordan and the South Arab Israel area, and the Ishmaelites, the Saudi Arabia area, Moab, Jordan, and the Hagrites, southern Arab Israel, Gebal, which is in Lebanon, Ammon, which is in Jordan, and Amalek, which is southern Arab Israel and Arabia, Philistia, which is in Gaza, the people of Tyre, which is in Lebanon. That's who's conspiring together. Still, from it was probably 580 BC, right up until like last week. Even Assyria, which is Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria, are the present countries of Assyria. They've joined them to lend strength to descendants of Lot. Again, who is Lot? He's in Jordan. He was the nephew of Abraham, but he didn't get part of the inheritance. And he ended up having sexual relationship with his daughter, but they were living, remember, in Sodom and Gomorrah, and how they were infected by all the culture in those cities, right? So all these people are working together, and this was written by the psalmist in about somewhere between 560 and 580 BC, and it's like it was written yesterday. That's exactly what's happened. Okay, so let me hit this really quick, because people keep asking, I hear it all the time, why are the Arab nations not accepting Palestinian refugees? Like, really, why isn't Egypt? Why isn't Lebanon? Why are these countries not accepting? Well, let's look very quickly. Jordan, 1967 and 1970, the Palestinian groups, a number of Palestinian liberation groups were operating in Jordan, and they were calling for the overthrow of Jordan's monarchy after the Six-Day War. And at that time, the PLO maintained its own army in Jordan. The PLO had its own army, and they were using their army to attack the people of Jordan, to rob them of money to finance their attacks against Israel. So they didn't care about the people of Jordan. They were in there abusing their brother Arabs in order to kill the people of Israel. Okay? And so in 1970, Jordan declared war on the PLO. And they drove them out of their country, but as the PLO was leaving, they assassinated the Jordanian prime minister. Okay? So sounds like they don't want him back. They want the PLO, So, Lebanon, 1974. PLO moved into Lebanon, and they aligned themselves with a number of Marxist and socialist groups there who were seeking to overthrow the Lebanese conservative Christian government. At one time, the Lebanese government was Christian, and they were conservative. And so PLO goes in there, let's attack Lebanon. And Lebanon ended up in a civil war, and the country has never fully recovered from that civil war to this day. It's never the country that it used to be. It was such a beautiful country. People used to talk about the restaurants there and how beautiful they were, and the food and the culture. And they've never so why would Lebanon want them back, the PLO back? Then we come to Kuwait, 1991. The PLO supported Saddam Hussein, his invasion into Kuwait. And as a result, the Kuwait government expelled nearly 300,000 Palestinian refugees right after the Gulf War. Because they say, we don't want you Palestinians because you're trying to overthrow our country too. Okay? I wonder why they don't want them. Okay? Then Egypt, 1978 to 1980. In 1978, Israel tried to get this. In 1978, Israel tried to give the Gaza Strip to Egypt. Tried to give it back to Egypt. They said, we don't want it anymore. There's no way. And then in 1980, to really infuriate Hamas, Egypt recognized Israel as a nation. And they're going, we don't have people back in our country now that are angry at us, like are just fuming angry at us for recognizing Israel. Also, Hamas is aligned with the Islamic Brotherhood and Iran, both of which are against Egypt. Okay, we're getting there. Summary. So, Palestinian organizations have not just attacked Israel, they have actually caused many problems in many of the neighboring Arab and Muslim countries for over 50 years. No country is safe, sadly, because of their obsession to destroy Israel. If you let them in, they will eventually cause an overthrow of your government in order to take over to get the finances to try to get rid of Israel. And so no Arab state today is willing to take any people from Gaza, Palestinian refugees. Okay? So, now we're getting there. Okay, now some good news, okay? Some good news, okay? God promised the land to Abraham about 4,000 years ago. A little over 4,000 years ago. And the people of Israel, actually, the Israelites, once they became called Israelites, they've inhabited the land on a continual basis for the last 3,200 years. They're not colonizers. They've been there for 3,200 years, okay? And since reestablishment of Israel as a nation, the radical elements have been committed to the complete destruction of Israel and the death of all Israelis, okay? No plan by any government can ever legislate peace as long as millions of people in that region believe they have no right to exist. Okay? We're just not talking about getting along with each other. They feel an obligation to worship Allah by killing all Israelis. How can you have peace? As I said, we keep talking, I've heard again last week, let's do a two-state solution. It will never happen as long as the mentality of one of those two states is we must destroy everybody in the other state. Okay? So, but God has a plan. This is the positive point. God has a plan. This is going to blow you away. This is going to really get, what? Who put that in the Bible, right? Okay. Okay, here we go. Did you read it? No. I know what happened there. Okay, here we go again. Prophet Isaiah 19, verses 24 and 25. In that day, Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria. Think about it. Israel and Egypt and Assyria will be considered one group by the Lord. A blessing, there'll be a blessing on the earth. Verse 25, the Lord Almighty will bless them, saying, blessed be Egypt, my people. Remember who Egypt is? They're the people that have now recognized Israel. And also Assyria, who is who? Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Syria, and Turkey. And who is my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance. Isn't this interesting? God says there's coming a day when all those countries around Egypt will actually be united. Right? Well, what about, this war and that war and whatever? It doesn't say the nations right next to Israel will ever attack Israel, like in a war. It says those nations are going to be my people, God says. Okay, see that again. In that day, Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria, blessing on the earth. The Lord Almighty will bless them, saying, blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance. Okay. Okay. So God is about to do something amazing. God is about to do something amazing. Okay, we're all worried. We're so worried about this war, that war, whatever, and what's going on in the Middle East. God says this is not fulfilled yet. This is a promise of God of these three people groups coming together. God's about to do something amazing, something miraculous in several of the countries around Israel, including Egypt, as I said, who has already recognized Israel as a country. Okay, here. In the last 2 years, 2/3 of Iran's mosques have closed. 2/3. How many is that? 50,000 mosques in Iran have closed because the people are tired of the extremism of their Muslim government. Okay. In the last 20 years, several million Muslims in over a dozen Muslim nations, including Jordan and Iran and Iraq and Syria and Kuwait and even Gaza, have been experiencing dreams and visions of Jesus. As a matter of fact, on November 10th of this year, just a few weeks ago, Michael Licona, a missionary in Gaza, He reported, okay, we're just talking 2 weeks ago, folks. Not even that. He reported that over 200 Palestinian men in Gaza had visitations of Jesus in their dreams in one night, the previous night. Over 200 people in Gaza, men, not women, okay, but the men, the fighters and everything. Over 200 of the men had visions of Jesus just 2 weeks ago in one night. And they sought out the Christians and said, how do I follow Jesus? This is what's going on by God, okay? This is what God is doing. God is turning the hearts of people in Iran, Iraq, even Gaza, okay? So now it's not the time to fear. Now it's the time to pray, to align ourselves with what God's doing. Don't listen to the news. So many of those reports are crazy. But when you hear what's actually happening in the Middle East, we're called to pray, not to fear. Called to pray. And we're going to talk more about that next week. Okay, I'm done for today. What do we do? Well, maybe we could pray. Let's read this together as a prayer, okay? Ready? God, thank you for how you are moving behind the scenes in the Middle East in signs and wonders. Lord, as you have commanded, I pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and I also pray that they would come to know Yeshua, Jesus, as their Savior and their Lord. Now, in your notes, there's some reflection questions at the end there. What I'd like to do right now is just, what can we do? Could you commit to pray for the Middle East? Okay? Just pray for Israel and for all of its surrounding neighbors, because they're all made in the image of God, right? The Jews and the Gentiles, the Muslims, the Palestinians, the Jordanians, the Arabs, they're all in the image of God. And they all came out of Abraham, right? They all came out of Abraham. So pray that Jesus would be made known and received by the people in that region so that we can, we can quicken the work by our prayers, what God is doing right now in the Middle East. In spite of the wars, in spite of the horrendous things that have been happening lately, we can quicken the move of God in the Middle East with our prayers. So could we maybe turn to somebody right now and just take 2 minutes and just pray for Israel, pray for Palestine, pray for the people in Gaza. Okay, just go ahead and turn to someone and just pray for about 2 minutes, okay? Just encourage you to pray together that we would lift up what God's doing in those countries, okay?